All right, let me read to you guys. How many of you guys have heard the reading from Legion 3 already? Nobody? Good. That's what I want to hear. I read it at Emerald City Comic Con, and it one thing before that. So Legion stories. If you haven't read these are kind of weird. These are stories that I started with a person who saw hallucinations, kind of like a schizophrenic, but not true schizophrenia. You would not diagnose Stephen Leeds with schizophrenia. That saw hallucinations, but the hallucinations helped him, right? The idea is this guy's a detective who has a built-in team of some 50 expert hallucinations that he uses to solve crimes. They are detective stories. But very weird detective stories. He can become an expert in something with he's just a genius. He can study it. Like in the first story, he's like, I need to know this language. So he picks up a book, studies the language, and then a person manifests that's a new hallucination for him who is an interpreter. Now, he doesn't actually speak the language, but he has someone standing next to him to interpret for him who's his hallucination and the repository of his knowledge of that language. And then when he wants to speak it, he says, all right, I want to say this. And everybody normal people can hear him say that, and they're like, all right, say it like this. And then he'll go sound it out so that he can speak. So it's like this kind of inefficient method, but at the same time, he's able to access all kinds of things. And his weird psychology and his aspects, as he calls them, his hallucinations, are a big part of it. There are three main ones who you will meet shortly, JC, and Ivy, and Tobias, who, not so secretly, are based on Gwyneth Paltrow, on Baldwin, the Jane from Firefly, what's his name? Adam Baldwin. Not the real Baldwin. The one who's not, well, he is a real Baldwin, he's not one of those Baldwins. I met him at a con, I'm like, you were just, in real life, so interesting. So it's based on him, not necessarily on Jane, because I met him at a con and I really liked him. And then Tobias is based on Morgan Freeman. So, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Yeah, this is the only story I've done that with, by the way, that I've cast actors in the role. But that was because he's seeing hallucinations, and I think he's building the hallucinations based on things he's seen in media. And so he is literally making a version of Morgan Freeman who follows him around and talks in a soothing voice. So, JC said, hands on hips as he regarded the building. Anyone else worried that this doctor's office is in a slum? It's not a slum, Ivy said, holding out her hand to help me from the back of the limo. Sure, JC said, and those aren't crack dealers on the corner over there. JC, those kids are like 6. He narrowed his eyes. Starting early, are they? Nefarious little entrepreneurs. Ivy rolled her eyes, but Tobias, an African-American man who was growing a little unsteady on his feet now that he was getting on in years, just laughed a hearty, full-throated laugh. He climbed out of the limo with my help, then slapped JC on the back. They'd been joking on the whole way here. JC grinned, showing he was at least a little aware of his buffoonery. I eyed the building. Though it was your ordinary 2-story generic suburb office structure, it was across the street from a pawn shop and next door to a mechanic shop. Not a slum, but also not exactly prime real estate, so maybe JC had a point in being worried. I rapped on the front passenger window of the limo, which rolled down, revealing a young woman with short blonde hair. Wilson's grandniece was shadowing him again. Right. I wish he'd left her behind today. I tended to be a little more erratic when I was visiting with reporters. I looked past her toward the tall, distinguished man in the driver's seat. Why don't you wait here, Wilson, I said, instead of going to the service station, in case we've got the wrong location or something. Very well, Master Leeds, Wilson said. His grandniece nodded eagerly. As comfortable as Wilson looked in his traditional buttling gear, she seemed awkward, wrapped in a coachman's coat and cap, like she was playing dress-up. Had she been listening as I sat in the back seat talking to my hallucinations? I was used to Wilson, but it felt wrong to expose myself to someone from the outside. I mean, I was used to people seeing my oddities when I was in public, but this felt different, an intrusion. I walked with my aspects into the office building, which had a familiar, sterile scent to it, not quite like a hospital, but frequently cleaned and scrubbed to give it the off-white scent of one. The first door to the right was number 16, where we were supposed to meet the interviewer. JC glanced in through the side window. "No reception hall," he said. "Just one large room. Feels like the sort of place where someone grabs you the moment you walk in. You black out and bam, 3 kidneys." 3? Ivy asked. "Sure," JC said. "They need unwitting mules for their illegal organ trade." "And exactly how unwitting are you going to be when you wake up with an incision in your abdomen? Wouldn't you immediately run to the doctor?" His eyes narrowed. "Well, the doctor's in on it, obviously." I looked at Tobias, who was still smiling. He nodded toward a painting on the wall. "That's Albert Bierstadt. Bierstadt. I always fail to pronounce that correctly. I'm sorry, art historians. That's Albert Bierstadt, he said. "Among the Sierra Nevada mountains. The original hangs in the Smithsonian," which I got to see, by the way, which is why it's here, as one of the more famous pieces from the Hudson River School of Artists. His calming tone was a relaxing contrast to JC's jovial but still deep-seated paranoia. "I've always loved how the clouds part with light above a dark wilderness, a representation of the creation as viewed through the lens of the American frontier. Our eyes are inevitably drawn toward the center light, as if we are being accepted into heaven." Or, Ivy noted, "perhaps the clouds are closing, and the landscape is dimming as God withdraws and leaves men in shadow." I started, glancing at Ivy. She was usually the religious one, sticking up for all things holy and Christianly. She shrugged and looked away. I knocked and the door opened, revealing a tall, older Asian woman with a squarish face and prominent smile lines. "Ah, Mr. Leeds, excellent." She gestured for us to enter, and JC, of course, went first. He ducked under her arm, deftly avoiding touching a real person. Then he looked around, hand on his weapon. Finally, he nodded for the rest of us to enter. The interviewer had set out a group of chairs for us, and she stood by the door a conspicuously long time for all of us to enter. She'd done her homework, though she waited too long. She couldn't see the aspects. Her efforts were to help with the illusion, for which I was grateful. Tobias and Ivy settled themselves while JC continued to inspect the room. A large set of windows to our right looked out on the curb where Wilson stood beside my limo. The far left wall of the room was dominated by a large saltwater fish tank. The rest of the decor was in a writing den theme, with hardwood bookcases and a deep green carpeting. I stepped up to the window and nodded toward Wilson, who waved back. 3 today, then?" the interviewer asked. I turned around, frowning. "I followed your eyes," she said, pointing to the 2 chairs where Ivy and Tobias sat, then to where JC had been standing, though he'd moved to search the bookcases for secret passages. "Yes, only 3, I said. "Ivy, Tobias, JC? You have done your homework." "I like to be prepared," the woman said, settling down in her own seat. "I'm Jenny, by the way, in case Lisa didn't say anything." This woman was Jenny Zhang, reporter and best-selling writer. She specialized in salacious pop biographies that rode the line between information, entertainment, and voyeurism. She had won awards, but really she was just another hack who had fought her way out of the clickbait trenches and found herself a measure of respectability. I wished I'd never promised Lisa the favor of doing an interview with one of her friends, but I was stuck. Hopefully Jenny wouldn't keep me too long, and her eventual book wouldn't be too painful. She nodded toward the seats, but I remained by the window. "Suit yourself," she said, getting out a notepad. She pointed at my aspects. JC, Tobias, Ivy. Id, ego, superego. "Oh, great," Ivy said. "One of those. Tell her we've been over this. It doesn't fit." "We're not fans of that psychological profile," I said to Jenny. "Ivy's the one complaining?" Jenny asked. "She's a repository of your understanding of human nature. You've externalized in her your people skills and your understanding of relationships. She's supposedly very cynical. What does that say about you, I wonder?" I shifted uncomfortably. "Hey," JC said, "that's not bad. But you've also created an external sense of peace and relaxation." Jenny pointed her pencil toward one of the seats. She had them reversed. She obviously meant Tobias this time. "You say he's a historian, but how often does his history knowledge prove relevant?" "Frequently," I said. "That's not what I hear," Jenny said. You claim to have limited slots in your given team of aspects. Imagining too many at once is difficult, so you only bring a few with you at a time. Yet you always bring these 3. JC, your sense of paranoia and self-preservation, is a logical inclusion, as is Ivy, who can help you interact with the social norms of the outside world. But why Tobias? She knows too much, Ivy said, standing up. Something's wrong with this interview. Do we really need to panic? Tobias said. So she's read the previous profiles that people have done of Stephen. Surely we should expect that. Wouldn't we be more suspicious if she hadn't come with some theories about our nature? I idled by the window, but finally JC nodded and sat down. He was satisfied. I stepped away from the window, but didn't sit. Instead, I walked up to the fish tank. It was extravagant, with variegated corals and beautiful lighting. So much work to create what amounted to a prison. Jenny was still writing. What did she find so fascinating? I'd barely said anything. I watched the fish pick at the coral, eating at their own confines. Don't you have any questions for me? I finally asked Jenny. Everyone else wants to know how I distinguish reality from hallucination. They want to know what it feels like to internalize knowledge, then shove it into an aspect. What happened to Ignacio? Jenny asked. I spun on her. Tobias raised his fingers to his lips, gasping softly. You mentioned Ignacio in past interviews, Jenny said, watching me with a poised pencil. He was one of your most favored aspects, a chemist. And yet, in a recent case you took, the one with the bacteria that could eat motor oil, you didn't involve him at all. Curious. Ignacio. He, like Justin, was no longer one of my aspects. Tobias cleared his throat. Did you see she had an Algernon Blackwood book on the shelf? Original Arkham House edition, which are my favorite. The feel of the paper, the scent, it is the scent of lore itself. You've frozen up, Jenny noted. Can you lose aspects, Mr. Leeds? Original Arkham House editions are rare, though that depends on what you want to read. I once had a copy of Bradbury's Dark Carnival from them, though the cover... What happened? Jenny asked. Did they simply move out? The cover did not age well. Ivy, I whispered. Right, she said, standing up. All right, so she's acting like this is an innocent question, but I don't buy it. She knew this would touch a nerve. Look how tightly she holds that pencil, hanging on your words. I'm sorry, Tobias said, dabbing his brow with a handkerchief. I'm not helpful right now, am I? She's goading us, JC said, standing up. He rested his hand on Ivy's shoulder. What do we do? She wants to push us off balance, Ivy decided. Steve, you need to reassert control of the conversation. But how much does she know? Tobias asked. Did she really guess what happened to Ignacio? You don't speak of these things often. He cocked his head. Stan says she might be working for them. Not helping, Tobias, Ivy said, spinning on him. Quiet, I said to them. Quiet, all of you. They quieted. I locked eyes with Jenny, who sat calm, twirling her pencil between two figures, feigned nonchalance. I couldn't keep unraveling every time Ignacio or Justin came up. I had to control this. I was not crazy. I'm not comfortable talking about this topic, I said, finally walking over and taking the seat she'd provided for me. Why not? Different question, please. Have you lost any aspects other than Ignacio? I can sit here all day, Jenny, I said, repeating the same words over and over. Is that how you want to waste your interview? The pencil stopped twirling. Very well, another question then. She shuffled through her papers. You maintain throughout interviews that you are not insane. That by your definition, insanity is the line beyond which a person's individual psychology infringes upon their ability to live a normal life. A line you've supposedly never crossed. Exactly, I said. The media pretends that insanity is this magical state that you can simply turn on or off, or that is simply on or off, like it's a disease someone can catch. They miss the nuance. Human brain chemistry is incredibly complex, and certain traits which, in extreme, are deemed insane by society can be present in many so-called normal people and contribute greatly to their success. So you deny that mental illness is indeed an illness? I didn't say that. I glanced at my aspects. Ivy, who sat down primly, crossed her legs. Tobias, who had strolled over the window, looking up to where he thought he could see Stan the astronaut in his satellite. JC, who had moved to lounge by the door, hand on his gun. I'm just saying, I continued, that the definition of the word insanity is a moving target and depends greatly upon the person being discussed. If someone's means of thinking is different from your own, but those thought patterns don't interrupt their life, then why try to fix them? I don't need to be fixed. If I did, my life would be out of control. That's a false dichotomy, Jenny said. You could both be in need of help and in control. I'm fine. And your aspects don't interrupt your life? Depends on how annoying JC is being at the moment. Hey, JC said, I don't deserve that. All three of us looked at him. Today, he added, I've been good. Ivy cocked an eyebrow. JC, on the way here, you said, and I quote, the police shouldn't be so racist to them towelheads, because it isn't their fault they were born in China or wherever. See, being good. JC paused. Should I have called them towel-headed Americans or something? Your id is speaking out. Jenny looked from me to JC. She was good at following my attention. He is not my id, I said. Don't try to pretend he somehow articulates my secret desires. I'm not certain he can articulate anything, Ivy added, as doing so would by definition require more than grunts. JC rolled his eyes. I stood up and walked over to the fish tank again. I always wondered, what did the fish know? Did the fish know they were in a cage? Could they comprehend what had happened to them, that their entire world was artificial? So, Jenny said, perhaps we could track your status, Mr. Leeds. 3 years ago, during your last interview, you said you were feeling better than you ever had. Is that still the case? Have you gotten better or worse over the last few years? It doesn't work that way, I said, watching a little black and red fish dart behind some fake yellow coral. I don't get better or worse because I'm not sick. I simply am who I am. And you never before considered your state to be an affliction, Jenny asked, because very early reports paint a different picture. They speak of a frightened man who claimed he was surrounded by demons, each whispering him instructions. That had been a long time ago. Find a purpose, Sandra had taught me. Do something with the voices. Make them serve you. Hey, JC interrupted. I'm going to go grab some jerky or something at the gas station. Anyone want anything? Wait, I said, spinning away from the fish tank. I might need you. What? JC said, hand on the doorway. Need me to be the butt of another joke? I'm sure you'll live. He stepped out, then pulled the door closed. I stood speechless. He'd actually left. Usually when JC disobeyed, it was because I tried to leave him behind or because I didn't want him practicing with his guns. He disobeyed to protect me. He didn't just walk away. Ivy ran to the door and peeked after him. Want me to follow? No, I whispered. So, Jenny said, we were talking about you getting worse. That's an Achilles tang, Tobias said, stepping up to me and nodding toward the little red and black fish. It looks black, but it's actually dark brown, sometimes even a dark purple. A beautiful but difficult fish to keep. That spot on the tail is the origin of its name, as it looks a little like the bleeding wound on an ankle. I took a deep breath. JC was just being JC. We were talking too much about aspects, and he hated being reminded he wasn't real. That's why he left. I've had some rough patches lately, perhaps, I said to Jenny. I need something to focus my aspects and my mind. A case? Jenny asked, pulling out a few sheets of paper from behind her notepad. I might be able to help with that. She sat the sheets on the coffee table in front of her. Ah, Ivy said, walking over to me. That's her angle, Steve. This is all preamble. She wants to hire you. She was putting you off balance, Tobias said with a nod. Perhaps to put yourself in a better bargaining position. This was familiar ground. I relaxed and walked over and settled down in the seat across from Jenny. All of this to offer me a case? You people, you realize you can just ask. You have a tendency to return letters unopened, Leeds, the reporter said, but she did have the decency to blush. What is this? I said, skimming. A machine that can use big data to predict a person's exact wants, updated minute by minute, incorporating brain chemistry with historic decisions, removing the need for most choices. Kind of interesting, Ivy said, reading over my shoulder. I guess it will depend on what she's willing to pay and what exactly she wants us to do. What do you want from me? I asked Jenny. I need you to steal My pocket buzzed. I absently glanced toward the phone, expecting a text from JC. He'd probably sent me a picture of himself drinking straight from the Slurpee machine or at the gas station or some similar nonsense. But the text wasn't from JC. It was from Sandra. The woman who had originally taught me to use my aspects. The woman who had brought me sanity. The woman who had vanished soon after. The text read simply, help. Well, in there. So there you go. That'll be out in the fall. You can get them all in the collection together.
Same publishing route as before?
This way, what we're going to do is we're going to do a Tor hardcover, and we're going to do a limited edition with Subterranean Press to match those who bought the limited editions there. Tor probably, this is how they work, won't release a separate ebook of it until the hardcover has had a run. So if you want to wait for the ebook, it'll probably be a year later, like what happened with Edge Dancer, where they released an ebook of that, or they just released a hardcover. Whatever. They released an ebook. So that's kind of their methodology. When I go through them, they want to. The booksellers really like it when there's something exclusive in the book, and that makes them shelve it and things like that. So if you haven't read the previous two, get the collection when it comes out. If you have read the previous two, you will be able to buy this one separately from Subpress, or a year later as a standalone story. So yeah, I'm very pleased with the story. It's weird, even for a Stephen Leeds story. I'll warn you about that. But it involves, as a little Easter egg, that story about big data who can predict all of your choices, that doesn't factor into the story. He runs off to do the Sandra thing, but that's a story I had a story idea for that I wanted to write. A world where big data predicted everybody's wants and needs this before they knew what they wanted. Maybe I'll actually end up writing that story, but if not, it has a cameo in this. So still some work to do on that. That's an early draft. So those of you who are recording it, just to let you know, just put early draft. There'll be some changes before it goes to print.